Today's show is sponsored by Equinix. We all utilize multiple cloud providers, and we know they aren't built to work well together. Things get a whole lot more complex when your hybrid infrastructure needs to connect with your multi-cloud portfolio. Equinix is the world's digital infrastructure company, providing on-demand infrastructure in over 25 metros, with hands-free provisioning and management, all connected to over 240 data centers and most major cloud providers. Equinix can help you deal with increasingly complex architectures, whether you want to run your favorite Kubernetes distribution or connect workloads between different cloud providers. To learn more, sign up at deploy.equinix.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST, CLOUDCAST, to get $500 in credits to get started today. That's deploy.equinix.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST and get those first $500 in credits today.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for Cloud News this week. And we have a ton of cloud news this week. Actually, too much to cover. So we're going to highlight a couple of the items and we're going to jump right in. First of all, Forrester did a wave for the integrated software delivery platforms. And we've been talking a good bit on the show recently about these and the delivery platforms. And the link in the show notes actually is from GitLab. GitLab did well in it. They're in the leaders quadrant. So, of course, they want to license the report and make it available for everyone. So I signed up for it. I read through a good bit of it. Really good report, really well put together, lots of information in there. And then, of course, in addition to GitLab, a number of others were in there. Atlassian was in there, CloudBees was in there, Circle CI is in there, and a number of the other folks in the industry as well. But in my old man yells at cloud moment for 1 second, I will say, at least it didn't look like it was available as a download. They kept saying, download the report. And then it wasn't a download. It was just a web page, which was slightly annoying because as my workflow is I kind of download a bunch of PDFs and dump them into a directory. And then when I get bored, I read industry reports. I know that's weird, but it's what I do. And the fact that I couldn't do that was kind of like, oh crap, what's going on here? Is PDFs going away? But that's my personal problem for another day. Jumping on to our second news article. And this was a really good, there was kind of some threads going around about this as well. Kelsey Hightower, this is a link to a Newsstack article on Kelsey predicting Kubernetes community and how it's going to evolve over the years. And I thought the interesting point was, hey, if Kubernetes is still around in 20 years from now, that would be sad because it means we didn't come up with better ideas. I thought that was really, really funny and insightful. But at the same time, there's been kind of different groups, and he talks about in the article, and I completely agree with this. Of course, there's the folks that have been, Kubernetes is 10-ish years old now. The folks that have been jumping in and dealing with all of it and jumping and handling all the pain. And then you have folks like, oh, I've been waiting on the sidelines because, it might be just a fad and it might pass, or because, hey, it's still complex and upgrades are still too hard. And so it kind of goes through, future generations and those waves of people in it. We've talked about it on the podcast many times about, S-curves and technology and at what point does it hit commodity status? And you kind of cross the chasm, if you will, as well. And so I think all of that is relevant here and definitely a good read to go check out. For our third article, Intel, and we've talked about Intel and their expansion plans, if you will, and they're wanting to make investments. It's no secret. Intel has fallen a bit behind in the chip production category over the years. And a lot of other companies, AMD, NVIDIA, Samsung, they've all come along and taken a good bit of this market from them. So they announced they're going to be doing investments around the world. And this particular one, they're going to invest more than 30 billion euros into not one, but two chip-making facilities outside of Berlin in Germany. And I thought this was really fascinating because it really is a serious investment for them. And it signals another step. I know they had announced some manufacturing here in the United States as well. And they will be continuing to announce this in the future as well. If I move on to the last article we're going to have time to talk about today, Cloudflare. Cloudflare launches Observatory, a tool for web monitoring or observability, but observability within their platform. I think this is a fantastic move for them, and there's lots of details in there. And of course, the marketing folks had to come up with a name. So real-time user monitoring, or RUM, RUM. So what they're basically doing is labeling this and bringing in all the data because, hey, you're running the applications on their infrastructure. They're able to bubble all of that up and then give you some good observability metrics into the environment. And it's a nice value add for them as well. And so certainly, I wouldn't say unexpected, but certainly a logical next step for Cloudflare and their value proposition. As I mentioned, that's going to do it for Cloud News this week, but there's lots of other articles this week. It was a pretty busy week, actually. There's some things in there about AWS having outages last week. We did say we wanted to put an AI article in there every week, and there's a guide to generative AI terminology. That's a good read. There's an article in there about New York Life and how they're planning for life after the data center. And some career advice as well. So a nice little roundabout of articles, but there's probably a good 7 to 10 articles in Cloud News this week. So definitely go give it a look. And so with that, I'm going to close out Cloud News for this week. And coming up right after the break, we're going to be talking about DevOps 2.0 with Adam Jacob.
Today's episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog. Bring speed and scale to your security organization. Datadog Cloud Security Platform delivers real-time threat detection and continuous configuration audits across applications, hosts, containers, and cloud infrastructure. Built on top of the observability platform, Datadog brings unprecedented integration between security and DevOps aligned to shared organizational goals. As a listener to the Cloudcast, you can sign up for a free 2-week trial to see for yourself how Datadog can elevate your cloud infrastructure security posture by visiting datadog.com/security-cloudcast. Sign up now and receive a free Datadog t-shirt. That's datadog.com/security-cloudcast. And we're back. And folks, as you know, if you listen for any period of time, one of the things that we love to do is, not only are always trying to find, really, really smart folks, really experienced folks for you, but anytime we can kind of combine that with people that are starting new companies, it's always been kind of the soul of this show is to go find new technologies, new companies that are, kind of introducing new things to the world, reinventing what's out there. We get a chance to combine a couple of those things today. So really, really excited about today. We're going to dive into somebody who is very much an OG in this cloud space, has actually been doing this longer than we've been doing the podcast. And we're really excited about the new things that he's got going on. So very, very excited to have Adam Jacob, who is founder and CEO of System Initiative. Adam, welcome to the show, man. Great to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm an OG. That makes me feel awesome, right? It's like me and like Snoop Dogg.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've been following. I'm gonna let you kind of do a good formal introduction. We've been following the work that you did at Chef for a long time. I know that you're great friends with our buddies over at Software Defined Talk. You've been on their show a number of times. But for folks that, for some odd reason, may not know of the work that you've done, your background, give folks a little bit of a background, both of what you were doing before System Initiative and then what's got you excited about really trying to reinvent DevOps.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that that you have to know who I am, right? It's not that weird. It's one of the things I think is weirdest about Silicon Valley, right? Is that like, it's possible to like do stuff in technology and then like, you're like kind of famous or whatever. Yeah, and like, I don't think you should be famous. I think that's weird. Anyway.
I think when you do really good work and you do things for, that the community has deep respect for, I think that sort of famous is interesting.
That's the good kind of famous, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. That makes me feel better. So I was a systems administrator in the beginning of my career. That tells you how old I am because that was still a job title. And I wound up doing a lot of like configuration management at the beginning of sort of the hyperscale era. So, back when like Facebook apps were a thing or whatever. And that led us to build a piece of software called Chef. And then I was a co-founder, and for most of the time I was the CTO of Chef. I was on the board. And then I left Chef 3-4 years ago. And then took a little time off. And the thing that for me was interesting was I loved every minute of Chef. I loved working on it. I loved the community we built. I loved the people that I met. I loved the companies that we worked with. And it kind of evolved alongside that idea of sort of DevOps, and not sort of, that idea of DevOps kind of evolved alongside the existence of stuff like Chef. And one of the things that I loved then and still love now is I love the aspiration of DevOps, the focus on collaboration, the focus on how we get to build better companies and have better work experiences through collaborating together, and then building tools that allow us to work at this really high rate of speed and in a safe and secure kind of way. And I think what I felt kind of toward the end of my time at Chef, and have only really seen more of since, was that we kind of failed a little to live up to our aspirations, right? Like, there was what we hoped would happen for everyone was that they would all be working together in this like easy, smooth way, and that we'd all be doing tens or hundreds or thousands of deploys a day. And like, most of us aren't, right? Most of us are lucky to do one a month, right? Still. And I don't think that's because our aspirations were too high. I don't think that's because like our dreams were too big. I think it's because our implementation was wrong. Like, I think it's not like any one thing's fault, but when you look at the whole system kind of holistically, when you added all the pieces up, they don't work together in a way that actually brings about the results we wanted to see. Yeah. And in fact, they kind of fight against us all the time. And so that was really where System Initiative came from. So along with my co-founders, we kind of all felt like if we wanted to find a way to do this better, it was going to be because we were going to have to find some way to sort of rethink how the whole system worked, because what was wrong was more foundational than just like a small tweak here or there would be, right? It wasn't going to be like, oh, well, the problem is you wrote it in the wrong language, right. Or you didn't like CI hard enough. Yeah. And so that's really what brought me to System Initiative, was the desire to like see if we could break some of those rules and change some of those foundational assumptions of how we think about the work, in order to really bring about really dramatically better outcomes.
Right. Yeah. And if you're listening to the show and you go, hold on a second, I've never heard of System Initiative before. Part of that is because we are releasing this today on June 21st, which is the day the company's launching. You guys are sort of launching and announcing. So, we had gotten early on when we did the podcast, we would do a lot with startups that were just launching. And I think over time we sort of said, well, maybe we should, let some of these things kind of mature and grow
percolate a little.
But when we get a chance to, and a lot of times they were, very first time founders, and you kind of had a sense of like, these are cool ideas, but I'm not sure they kind of know the how big the boulder is they're pushing up the hill. I think the opportunity,
how dangerous this will really be.
Exactly, how challenging it is. And I think the opportunity to talk to you as you're, like you said, sort of relaunching this thing that you've been passionate about for 10 plus years, more than that.
Since before it had a word.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And really kind of going back probably to first principles and saying, we're not less passionate about it. We don't think that the possibilities are there, but maybe the way that we went about it before. So I'm, with that sort of in mind, like, walk us through a little bit for anybody who maybe wasn't around when DevOps was sort of first getting started. Like, what did the community kind of get right? What didn't, what sort of, either they didn't get right or didn't work out the way you expected, and what are some of the kind of the new things that you're starting to dig into?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you cast your mind back to the like early days of DevOps, the things that were happening in the world, virtualization had sort of come up, but like EC2 had just started to launch. Do you know what I mean? So like when the way you think about like AWS and serverless and all, like none of that stuff didn't exist yet, right? It was like, it was still mostly servers and racks. But then there were really large scale for the time web companies, right? So the Facebooks and like Yahoo, right? Yep. And nobody thinks about Yahoo anymore, but at the time Yahoo was a big deal, right? Still. And you had like smaller startups like Flickr, who had figured out how to work together in a way that allowed them to build what at the time were these really revolutionary web platforms. And they did it by changing the way they worked in this really fundamental way. Like they sort of recognized that the split between systems administrators at the time, operations people, and engineers was a mistake. That in fact, in order for these things to work well, like the feedback loop between those two things needed to be tighter. And I think that insight that said, hey, if we want to deploy 10 times a day, 100 times a day, 1,000 times a day, what we need to do is sort of come closer together, right? And the distance between the decision to write some code and the decision to see that code running in production needed to be tighter. That was really true. Like that's really real. There isn't another way to do that, right? And then we started trying to figure out how to help other people do it in different contexts. So, you take that idea and it gets mushed together with some agile and some like lean thinking and some, like gold rat style optimization. And then what comes out the other side is sort of DevOps, where you're like, okay, I'm going to go. Then it was like digital transformation. Do you remember digital transformation?
Oh yeah.
We were, because what we were doing was trying to teach all these enterprises, like how to do DevOps, right?
Right. How to build software better and make it change without breaking and all that stuff. Yeah.
Totally. And I think, and roughly big block letters, like if you remember the before time and the after time, there's no question you want to live in the after time,
Right.
Like we did make it better. It is better. Right. But if you think about the first presentation that sort of launched the DevOps movement, which was like John Allspaw and Paul Hammond's like 10 deploys a day presentation at Velocity, where they just explained how they deployed Flickr 10 times a day. How most of us can't deploy 10 times a day right now,
Right.
And that's because the shape of the tooling and the shape of the way that we think about that work has evolved in ways that actually make it harder. When we think about how we work together at larger and larger scales, right? How you go from Flickr scale to Yahoo scale to, Facebook scale to Citibank to Bank of America. Like we didn't actually wind up building those tools around what we wanted to see. We didn't start from saying, okay, if in order to move this quickly, we need to collaborate together better. We didn't build these tools for collaboration. We built tools for configuration management and for application deployment and continuous delivery pipelines and continuous integration and, all this stuff, all of which are good things. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like infrastructure as code tools, like we need all that stuff. We did, maybe we thought we did, right? In order to sort of collaborate harder. I think in the end, what we got were systems that weren't actually very collaborative, that in fact, they tended to, like their collaboration happens around code review, which is like in the name. It's not collaboration, it's review,
Right.
Work already happened, and when you think about the feedback loops, like how long before you're right or wrong, 40 minutes, 30 minutes, more,
Sure.
Easy. And so when we think about sort of what's broken with that model, like it really is that like when you put all these tools together end to end and you stand them all up and you go, great, now you can all work really well together. The answer is not really. The answer is, yep, we have pipelines. Yes, it's better than not having pipelines. Yes, we have infrastructure as code tools, and that's better than not having infrastructure as code tools. But you don't like grab a developer and work together to get their feature shipped through the infrastructure as code pipe. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
right.
that doesn't happen, right?
Yeah. We created a set of tools that on paper should work together very, very well. And in theory, people are going to collaboratively work around them. But it's almost as if we sort of underestimated the friction that people create in what has to happen and the challenges of just collaboration without all the tools there. It's almost like the system needed to incorporate the people, the collaboration aspect, the friction layers, like you said, the feedback loops, more so than just here's another layer of tools to have,
that's exactly
feels a little bit like, kind of if you look at the famous now squinting CNCF landscape.
Totally
cool. We have thousands of tools. We're still only deploying so much per day.
Yeah, and it's not because any individual tool is garbage.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Right.
It's not like you can look at it and be like, wow, we don't need any of those ones. Like they all exist because they solve a problem for a real person, There's people who love them. They're not bad, but like you put them all together and you don't get what you hope for. And I think the sort of DevOps movement needs now, to me, it does feel a little like we're stuck in like a little trough of disillusionment where people are like, well, these outcomes weren't what we hoped for. So maybe we don't need to maybe it's not DevOps anymore. Maybe it's really platform engineering, that's what we needed all along. Or maybe it was, whatever we're going to call it. I don't know. And to me, like what we need is like a second wave of DevOps where the people who believe in what those core values of DevOps really were, and the aspirations of what we thought we could accomplish sort of rally. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And instead of like letting that die and going, well, or letting it transform into some other thing, instead we say, well, what if we just tried harder? Like, what if we did something different? What if we broke some of those rules and like took some risks and tried to build systems that fundamentally worked differently than the ones we have? Because we know that if you use the ones we have, the DORA report, I think, has like 88% of the people who reported like stuck in the shitty middle, Right. So we sort of know what the outcomes will be if you do it the way we do it now, which is the middle, right?
Right.
And so if we want it to be better than the middle, like I think we need to rally a little and try some new things and really truly see if we can invent some new technology that solves these problems in some fundamentally different, better ways.
Yeah, well, and I think you highlight the DORA report. For those that don't know, it's sort of the origination of the State of DevOps report, the research behind it, and so forth. That Nicole and Jess and Gene and all those folks were working on. But you do highlight something really interesting. Like people can say, well, maybe we just got tired of DevOps and it evolved into SRE or it evolved into platform engineering. Mm-hmm. But the data sort of says like, look, there was an initial spike of what DevOps and infrastructure as code and all these things did for the early adopters, right? You saw this 10x. Certain groups were 10x better, but like you said, over time that less early adopter group, the group that wasn't maybe out of Silicon Valley or the group who didn't have as much complete control over what they were doing, they, like you said, they sort of, I don't want to say they bottomed out, but they sort of hit a plateau or hit a ceiling of how good they could get. And I'm sure, like you said, they're trying their asses off. Like they're like,
oh yeah,
I'm doing all the things, man. I went to the meetups and I'm using the tools and I'm just like, shit, what's holding me back? Pardon my language, pardon my French.
No, but look, like that's literally why I decided that was what happened to me when I realized I needed to leave Chef. Like I was in this meeting and it was with these lovely people who were at a Fortune 50 company in America. And it was all their technology leadership. And this guy asked me to solve this really hard problem for him. And he was like, help me figure out how to unfuck this thing. And so I like went to the whiteboard and I told him how to do it. And he high-fived me, right? Which if you've ever been in a business meeting where your like key stakeholder high-fives you, like that, you're supposed to feel amazing when that happens, right?
It's a rarity.
I felt nothing, like all I wanted to do was go home. And part of it was because I knew that he was going to fail, right? Yeah. Like for as much as I could give him the wisdom and tell him what it was, like the amount of stuff that had to be just right and had to be like glued together just so and had to be like, like all the different tools that had to be stitched together, and you couldn't compromise here because if you did, this thing would go wrong and then the whole thing falls apart. It was just way too brittle.
Right.
And it's because I think the fundamental design of the system itself is wrong. Like some of the fundamental assumptions that we decided were necessary in order to build these systems safely and effectively, like they worked for a while, but they no longer serve us like we thought they would, because our requirements have changed. Like we actually didn't create, we took the techniques that we understood before the cloud existed, before serverless was a thing, before Docker existed, before almost all of this stuff ever existed. We're still basically riffing on the same set of core techniques and just sort of riffing a little harder,
Right.
And I think what I've learned is that they just, they kind of don't serve us as well as we hope they would.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. Walk us through a little bit of this sort of, wave two, the kind of the principles, the philosophy behind what you guys are doing at System Initiative, kind of what you're calling, DevOps 2.0 or second wave. Like what are some of these core things that people are going to start reading about and going like, okay, this is the new mindset I have to start trying to consider adopting.
Totally. Well, I think like with second wave DevOps, like part of why I think that that's an important thing to get out into the world is that I think there's lots of people who have this same revelation that what we need to do is like fundamentally break some shit. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like we need to change how some things are working here in order to get better. And so I think when I talk about sort of DevOps, second wave DevOps, like I'm thinking about all of those people, not just System Initiative, right?
Yeah.
I think from my point of view, what I think sort of where I began was a little, and we began, not just me. There's, I have co-founders. There's
Sure.
tons of people who built it. Was sort of where my expertise really lies, which is thinking about like how do we build systems of automation that allow us to work at different levels of semantic scale, so different levels of like one person needs to understand really deeply, how this particular EC2 instance is configured, or how this load balancer works, or how the database is tuned, or how the Kubernetes cluster is set up. Another person is working at the layer more of like, this is what an application means sort of inside of our world. And ultimately, how do we build a system that lets people do that in a way that feels more like you're using Figma or Notion and less like you're using Terraform, right? Yeah. Not just that it's visual, but that the feedback loops are really fast, right? So, how do you turn what is a 10 or 15 minute feedback loop into something that's like instantaneous or near instantaneous? And so what we came up with was basically building a simulation of the real system. So rather than writing infrastructure as code that then sort of describes what you want to see, instead you build this model of the real world resources that you want. So imagine they're like 1-to-1 to like an EC2 instance or a Docker image or, a butane configuration for a Fedora CoreOS node.
Yeah. Sort of like the digital twin concept that we hear sometimes with
exactly like the digital twin concept. That's exactly what it is. Okay. So you're building a digital twin of a digital resource, right?
Gotcha.
And what's cool about digital twins is that then we can build a simulator that allows us to say like, well, is this a reasonable configuration, right? Like, would these things even work if you plugged them together this way? And we call those things qualifications. So you can basically qualify the model to say, hey, as far as we can tell, this thing will work or it won't. And it can tell you like, hey, what this, your EC2 instance, what it needs is a security group, Yeah. Or, and then we can also use the model to infer configuration. So if you think about, setting up you have a port number running in a Docker container, and you want to be able to use that same port number sort of throughout the infrastructure until at the end it's like in a load balancing pool somewhere, right? So in System Initiative, you can express that port as a exposed port of the Docker image. And then when you build a relationship to, say, a butane configuration or to an ingress rule in AWS, it knows how to take that port number and translate it into the correct syntax and then generate the code for you and then keep the model up to date. So as you change that port number in the Docker image, it automatically would reconfigure the load balancers, right?
Right.
And we can do all of that roughly in real time because we're doing it in a simulator. And then we look at the real world and capture the real actual resource. And then we can compare the two to let you reconcile the simulation to the system or vice versa. So you can actually go both directions, right? So you can look at a real world resource and build a model, right? Yeah. Because it's like a one-to-one kind of thing. And then that whole thing is like wrapped in a UI that is multiplayer and lets you program how it works. So under the hood, it's a bunch of JavaScript functions, and it's all fully programmable by the user. So you can change how it behaves in any way you want to.
Interesting. So if I play this back a little bit and apologize for my sort of naivety to it, it's
no,
you're trying to combine a couple of things, right? So on one hand, systems are complex, and we can talk about 10x engineers all day long, but the reality is like most people are, 10x depth in one area, but not everywhere. And most companies can't afford 10x everywhere. So you're sort of like, well, I have a bunch of 3x engineers that I'd love to perform like 10x. I'd like a system that is smart enough to understand where, A is supposed to talk to B and C and D, but also smart enough to understand like, hey, there's a bunch of either dependencies or, outcomes that you're probably going to forget. And the system should just be smart enough to be like, oh, no, you're doing this. Cool. That means this, this, and this. And like you said, the ability to model things ahead of time, right? It's, we've all seen a million, PowerPoint slides that are like, this is what the perfect system looks like. And you're like, cool. Why can't I make that happen in the real world?
Yeah. Right? Why doesn't that ever actually work?
Yeah. Why doesn't that, the lines all connect to the clouds in those slides. Why doesn't that work in real life? And then it seems like there's a certain amount of deterministicness that we learned from containers and Kubernetes and other stuff that we didn't necessarily have in the early days, the VM days and kind of code drift and configuration drift. It feels like there's a lot of, like you said, like the core outcome is still similar, right? I want to deploy a whole bunch, but the tools, the technology, the techniques have evolved over 10 plus years. So Why don't we make that the starting point?
Yeah, I think that's right. That was a great summary. Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things we realized, it took a long time to build System Initiative. We've been working on it for 3 years because nothing like it has ever really existed in the world before. And I think the one of the things we learned was that if we came up with a system that was good at building the simulation, so if we figured out how to build the simulation, then we could make it open to whatever the technology was that it needed to simulate, right? Because ultimately it's really just defining like, well, what are the properties you can set in the model? And then how do those relate to the properties in the real world? And then how do we track those two things? And then how do we write functions that take the data from both sides and then give us interesting feedback, right? And then execute the right functions at the right time. So, under the hood, it kind of feels like it works a little more like how React or Vue works, than how like a traditional configuration management system works. And it's really cool. But part of what makes it work is that you really don't care as much about how the technology works. If you look at how something like Terraform works or like Pulumi works, for example, both cool tools, they do make some assumptions about how the underlying systems should behave, right? Like Terraform's like, you shouldn't have a default VPC, right? And like System Initiative doesn't really do that, right? It's like what we do is model whatever the thing is as the upstream sort of does it, right?
Yeah.
And the upside of that is that there's a lot less that people have to learn, right? Because you're not having to translate, well, AWS works this way and it has these quirks and weirdnesses, And then here's how I translate those quirks and weirdnesses to the quirks and weirdnesses of Terraform, right? And so like one thing that we really discovered was that when you just model it as it is and you don't try to change it or tweak it or normalize it, like it's actually much easier for people to use and navigate and to build complex things with, because they only really have to understand the thing they already understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it feels like, and this is, I don't mean this to be a terrible analogy, but it kind of popped in my mind. There's a thing that people do where, people talk about, there's all these kids who spend thousands of hours playing video games.
Yeah.
And they've gotten so many reps that, for example, if they, and again, terrible analogy, I don't mean to relate it to you guys.
I don't know, I'm kind of into it.
You see them, you see them talk about like in the military, they no longer have to have necessarily fighter pilots. They can have like drone pilots that are thousands of miles away, because the systems, the people have, trained on these systems. They understand what they do, but they don't have to be learning in sort of the middle of the battle. They're learning, they're able to do, 10x the amount of learning curve acceleration through these simulations. It feels a little bit, and again, it didn't mean to make that sort of wartime analogy to what IT does, but it does feel like there's this ability to learn with the system as opposed to learning kind of, in the place where you could be screwing up the business because you were like, well, I'm trying to figure out if the firewall will work this way. It's like, it's almost like instead of going like, hey, we created chaos engineering, and chaos engineering might blow stuff up, but it also could do cool stuff. It's like, why would I do that? Why wouldn't I just, let it run through 10,000 models the same way that, things do to simulate sporting events or other stuff? As I'm thinking about this, I'm kind of like, yeah,
that's kind of right.
We do this in other domains like this.
We do it in so many, but not in this one.
Yeah.
In this one, we decided that the best we could hope for was a plan.
Yeah.
Was saying like, oh, what would you delete?
Right.
And like, even that is like a fascinating thing. Like, because of the way we think about the way that those tools are designed, if you make a change, most likely what needs to happen is we're going to destroy the resources that exist and rebuild them. Right. Even if there's an API that exists that would just do the thing you want it to do. So like, you want to change the tags on some resources? Well, too bad, like they're going to die now, and like there's totally an API that would just let you tag them. You could log into the AWS console and type and it'd be fine. But you can't, because if you do, all your tooling breaks and the deployment pipeline will fail and it'll override it later. And, like all this stuff starts to happen. And so like one of the things that we really believed would work and did, I think in the end turn out to work was that if you start from this place that says, okay, the loop that I want to see as a user is one that gives me immediate feedback, that allows me to like summon my friends when I need help, like if I need an application developer to help me understand what's happening, or I need a DBA to understand something, or I want to talk to a DevOps engineer or an SRE, like I can just bring them in and they can come to the same change set that I'm working in, and we can do that work together, literally together,
Right.
And we can see it visually. We can write the code if we need to. We can do all that in a simulation, knowing that everything we're doing won't actually change the real world until we're ready, right? And then also admitting that the real world isn't wrong. So like one of the core assumptions of how we built these DevOps tools is by saying that the world is actually this hostile, wrong place that's full of drift and badness, and then there's the pure world of code in our heads, and that world is always correct. And so one thing that we do is admit that there's actually two versions of the world, and that the job is reconciliation, right? So it's not that the world is always wrong. Sometimes the world is right. Sometimes what people need to do when they're fixing a problem is just go to the AWS console and make with the clicky, right? Because they know how, because it's what they needed to do, because the tool doesn't expose it in the way they needed it to. And then later on, they need a way to say, hey, my model should work this way, update the model to reflect what's happened. And to get that kind of feedback loop and to make it work that way, you have to fundamentally change the way that we think about working.
Yeah. I have a million questions about how the technology works and things. I'm going to defer that to folks who can go see the demos you guys will build and the docs and stuff as the project launches and so forth. I'm curious. So you obviously you've got a bunch of people, I assume, that you've worked with over the years, people and trust, and other people that are, very, very smart in this space, whether it's, other DevOps people or systems people.
Yeah.
I'm curious, over the last 2 or 3 years, as you've been building this, like what, as you're showing them things or you're, kind of bouncing ideas off them, what surprised you in terms of their feedback? What did you surprise them with? Like, what's been sort of the evolution of this?
Yeah. I mean, I think one big one is just one of the things we realized was that you had to change how the user interface works if you wanted the feedback loops to be really fast. And so figuring out the right balance of how do we build a user interface that allows you to like see all this information and make good decisions, and then also not sacrifice any of the inherent power that we have today. So it can't be any less powerful than the existing tooling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we did a ton of user studies and research to just get to a place where people could use it easily and understand what was happening,
Yeah.
Some of the early versions we built worked, but no one could understand them.
Gotcha.
They were like,
Yeah.
I don't know what this is. I don't know how to use it. So like there was a lot of iteration on like, oh, what's the right, how should this feel? Like, what should it be? And that's still happening. We hear a lot of the overwhelmingly the reaction is really positive. Like people are stoked. The thing that you tend to hear, which is true, is it's still kind of early days, right? So there's the core of what System Initiative is and can be and do. And that core is really ready to be built on and experimented with, right? But it's not finished. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's not like, it's not done. And so a lot of the feedback we hear now is the feedback that says, that's super cool. I would love to use that in my environment. Here's the list of things that we need to tackle to get there, Like here are the different pieces of scale we need to think about, or here's, I need to be able to take qualifications, for example, will give you real-time feedback that a change you want to make is good or bad. It's also a really great way to think about encoding like compliance policy, for example, right?
Yeah.
And so we hear lots of feedback sort of on that vein. One of the things I expected to hear and didn't, DevOps historically was full of really brutal tribes, right?
Yeah.
Like you were a chef person or a puppet person, you were,
right,
a Kubernetes person or not, programming language tribes. Like we love a tribe. And I sort of expected that I would get more tribalism the more I started to talk about System Initiative. Does that make sense?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That there would be like more people sort of rejecting it, either because I was of the wrong tribe or because it was like weird for their tribe currently. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Right. And I've gotten like almost like very little of that so far.
Interesting.
And I think it's because people are kind of ready, like, whether they believe in System Initiative or not. So like whether they're converted to this point of view or the belief that we can figure out how to make it work sort of for everyone and at high scale. Like I do feel like people in general are pretty resonant with the idea that we need to do something dramatic,
Yeah. Well, And I think in all fairness, I mean, I think you can have a realistic conversation and say like, look, I don't care if you're a Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt, Pulumi, Terraform person, like you're probably pretty proud of what you've done. And the technology is all very good. And people picked which one they liked the best. And, you can have favorites and so forth. But at some point, like you said, if you're really honest with them and you just ask like, hey, are you really satisfied with how far you've gotten? You're probably going to get a lot of like, right? Like, yes, but And so, if you accept that part of it, then the openness to something new becomes less tribal and more like, well, what are you thinking? What's out there?
And if there's one thing I could do to sort of get that I hope happens sort of either as a result of System Initiative existence or as a result of these conversations, it's actually just that all those people who feel like meh inside decide to do something about it.
Yeah.
And like, because we built this all, like everything we have, we built by hand. You know, like we lit like a human being literally did all of this, and we can just do it differently because we want to.
Yeah.
Like we don't need a better reason, right? And it turns out we have a better reason.
Right.
You know, like there is actually a pretty good reason to do it, but we don't have to settle for meh. You know, like we can try new things, and we should get more excited about it. And I think one of the things that I've seen happen in our community in the past is a little bit of like when people try things that are new or that are a little too weird, like we tend to go for the throat sort of tribally, you know?
Right.
And I think that's because DevOps was sort of on the come up in terms of its potential and its economic potential. And do you know what I mean? There was everybody had a lot personally riding on those outcomes, myself included. Right.
Sure.
And I think now that we're kind of in a little trough of disillusionment, maybe there's a moment for us all to sort of recognize that it's maybe time to have another burst of innovation again, you know?
Yeah.
Like
exactly.
it might be time to actually try those new things and to recognize that we want people to try them, that you don't have to be right in order for it to be valuable. Do you know what I mean? Like how many great things showed up in the world a little too early. And then, 10 years later, it was perfect. Like I bet I've talked to a dozen people who wrote the business plan for DoorDash, when Cosmo did it,
Right. No, I say all the time, there aren't that many new ideas, but a lot of times I always say a lot of things will change if the economics of bandwidth and the economics of CPUs change, like 10x, like that old idea might be completely viable now. And sometimes the timing's right and sometimes the timing's wrong. And sometimes it's the personality driving it, or it's whatever. Like there's a lot of things that are beyond just like, oh, it was just a great idea. Like there's a lot of context around it.
Totally.
I'm gonna kind of make that the last thing, just because I know, obviously you're starting a company, you're launching a company, you're very, very busy. If folks want to engage with you, obviously we just scratched the surface here. If they want to reach out to the team, if they want to start learning about this, maybe potentially playing with the technologies, what's going to be the best way to engage?
Well, they should go to systeminit.com, and they can sign up for the private beta. And that private beta, I don't think it's going to last very long. We have some features we want to get in around sort of customization, and a few things like that before we just open source it to the universe. But yeah, the right thing to do is go to systeminit.com. You can sign up for that private beta. You should join our Discord. Part of being more public about what we're doing and building is trying to be more public about sort of what we're building and how we're building it, but also the broader conversation about like, what do we need to do to make DevOps better and to sort of live up to its own aspirations. And I think I'm really hopeful that we can sort of have that conversation in public together.
Yeah. Nice. And it'll be software, it'll be SaaS, some combination of the two.
All of the above. Yeah. So initially it'll be open source software, which you can of course run on-prem if you want to, and that'll always be a viable way to run System Initiative if that's what you want to do. And then we'll run multiple variations of SaaS, ranging from sort of bring your own cloudy kind of SaaS, where it's more like, you hand us a VPC and we like manage the infrastructure for you inside of it. Or sort of all the way to like pure multi-tenant SaaS, where you kind of show up with a credit card. So all that stuff is sort of on the table.
Cool. Very, very cool. Well, listen, folks, we want to thank Adam for his time today. Always excited when new companies get started and we get a chance to sort of see it early in the day. So Adam, thank you so much for the time. We learned a ton, enjoyed the conversation. Folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up. On behalf of Aaron and I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you all for telling a friend, helping us grow the community. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.